Thank you, David. Dan, it's a pleasure to be back. Good morning, everyone. I want to start by thanking NASA for convening today's UAP Independent Study public meeting and inviting me to continue to participate. NASA has been an invaluable partner to our team at AARO as we work to better understand and respond to unidentified anomalous phenomena. We applaud NASA for commissioning its independent study team and for exploring what data and tools could be leveraged to shed greater light on UAP. Though NASA and AARO are taking on very different aspects of the UAP problem set, our efforts are very much complementary. We both are committed to the scientific method, to a data-driven approach, and the highest standards of scientific research integrity. While NASA is evaluating unclassified data sources for its study, AARO's data set includes classified material with a focus on national security areas. However, all of this data collectively is critical to understanding the nature and origin of UAP. NASA brings unique capabilities, world-class scientists, and a wealth of academic and research linkages. NASA also has access to Earth sensing satellites, radiological sensors, tools for gravitational wave, geomagnetic wave detection, and means for analyzing open source and crowdsourced data that may assist both AARO and NASA in their UAP efforts. We are very grateful for the partnership and welcome the opportunity to join with NASA to share our collective findings with the public as the U.S. government moves towards greater transparency on this issue. Last month, I testified before members of the Senate Armed Services Committee on emerging threats and capabilities and shared some of the progress made since AARO's establishment in July 2022. I discussed AARO's scientific and analytic approaches, its efforts to improve UAP data collection, standardize our reporting processes, leverage our partnerships, and meticulously review the U.S. government's UAP-related historical records. As I told the subcommittee then, the resolution of all UAP cases cannot be accomplished by DoD and the intelligence community alone. AARO's ultimate success will require partnerships with the interagency, industry, academia, the scientific community, and the public, which all bring their own resources, ideas, and expertise to the UAP challenge. We believe robust collaboration and peer review across a broad range of partners will promote greater objectivity and transparency in the study of UAP. Of course, NASA's UAP independent study team was convened very much in that spirit. I also emphasized to Congress that only a very small percentage of UAP reports display signatures that could reasonably be described as anomalous. The majority of unidentified objects reported to AARO and in our holdings demonstrate mundane characteristics of readily explainable sources. While a large number of cases in AARO's holdings remain technically unresolved, this is primarily due to a lack of data associated with those cases, very much along the lines of what David was just speaking about. Without sufficient data, we are unable to reach defendable conclusions that meet the high scientific standards we set for resolution. Meanwhile, for the few objects that do demonstrate potentially anomalous characteristics, AARO is approaching these cases with the highest level of objectivity and analytic rigor. This includes physical testing and employing modeling and simulation to validate our analyses and the underlying theories, and then peer reviewing those results before reaching any conclusions. AARO has shared these cases with the appropriately cleared NASA team members in order to discuss and help recommend potential scientific areas of study that NASA may want to take lead on. I'll underscore here, as I did before Congress, that AARO's work will take time if we are committed to doing it right. AARO is committed to the highest standards of scientific research integrity, as we know our partners at NASA are as well. Thanks again to NASA for hosting this public forum for UAP discussion and information exchange. And I'd like to turn to a brief presentation that includes some recently declassified footage and trends for discussion. Next slide, please. So some of you probably saw a version of this at the open hearing last month, This is an overall review of all of the analytic trends of all the cases that we have to date. While the numbers may have changed a little bit, the overall trends remain the same. Most of what we are seeing reported by aircraft are at the altitudes where we fly aircraft. That should not be a surprise. You will note, however, that I have no space reports and I have no maritime reports. That is notable, even though we are looking across all of those domains. On the upper right, we have UAP morphologies. The vast majority of what has been reported and what we have data on, a little less than half now, are orbs, round spheres. And in the bottom right, you will see in the heat map of the areas where we get most of our reporting. This is very much a collection biased map. This is where our sensors are, our military and our IC and some of the FAA data. In the middle, it is what we call our typical UAP characteristics for the vast majority of the cases that we see. One way of looking at that is we'll call it a target package. This is the thing we are out hunting for in most cases. Next slide, please. This is an example of one that I showed at the hearing recently. This is a spherical orb, metallic, in the Middle East, 2022, by an MQ-9. I will come back to the sensor question that David raised here in a moment. This is a typical example of the thing that we see most of. We see these all over the world, and we see these in making very interesting apparent maneuvers. This one in particular, however, I would point out, demonstrated no enigmatic technical capabilities and was no threat to airborne safety. While we are still looking at it, I don't have any more data other than that. And so being able to come to some conclusion is going to take time until we can get better resolved data on similar objects that we can then do a larger analysis on. Next slide, please. I'm going to let this play through. This is a newly released video. You'll notice there are two dots moving back and forth. There is a plane at the bottom that's moving across the screen, and now there are three dots moving back and forth. The moving back and forth is from the sensor and the platform that's collecting it. This is a P3 on a training mission in the Western United States. They picked these up and they tried to intercept and was unable to intercept them. Apart from that motion, and you'll see a little bit of defocusing from the sensor itself, there is no other oddity about this, except for the fact that they couldn't catch them. The reason they couldn't catch them is because after further analysis, it was shown that those objects were actually much farther away from the P3 than they thought. And in fact, when we went even deeper, looked at air traffic control data, we were able to match those to aircraft on a major flight corridor heading into a major airport for landing. This is the kind of thing that can spoof and or provide misperception of both very highly trained pilots as well as sensors, right? And this was reported as an odd grouping of 3 UAP. All right. That is not to say that the pilots didn't know what they were looking at, or they knew what they were looking at, but they weren't really sure. But it also is meant to say that when they're not sure, they're reporting it now, and that's what they're supposed to be doing. And then we have to go look at it. Next slide, please. That brings us to really what is AARO doing in the science and technical realm. So this is one of those areas that I'm going to expound a little bit more on than we did in the last hearings. AARO has a robust scientific plan that we are required to then provide to Congress here pretty soon. One of the first things that we're doing is looking across all the existing sensor data against that typical UAP target that I gave you up at the very first slide. That goes beyond DoD and IC sensors. That's commercial, that's civil, and with partnership with NASA sensors and NOAA sensors. Understanding if any of these Earth sensing satellites, any of these airborne platforms, any of these ground radars, whether it's FAA or other, can actually see these things, given what we've got so far, is going to be an important first step to understanding which sensors are going to be relevant. From there, we are augmenting with dedicated sensors that we've purpose-built, designed to detect, track, and characterize those particular objects. We will be then putting those out in very select areas for surveillance purposes. Partnerships with academia, exploring the signatures to match to our data, so understanding if a thing is moving and if it is doing certain anomalous activities, what are the signatures we would expect to see? How do we pull on that? And then from there, how do I tune my collection architecture to go after it? Statistical analytic techniques. We're working with a couple of universities on how do I do broader-based statistical analysis on unclassified and classified data so that I can apply those analytics to our holdings. And then AI and ML analytic techniques for searching out through the data what are the objects, what are the targets that we're going after. We have partnerships with both DoD and DOE labs to explore our current state-of-the-art fundamental physics of UAP observations, both current and historical. In other words, if I have objects, those few that are doing some things that are anomalous, what is our current understanding of maneuverability, speed, signature management, propulsion? What are those underlying signatures that we would expect to see, and how do I then pull on that? Our interagency and allied partnerships for calibration of our capabilities. This is exactly what David was pointing at. A vast majority of what we have reported to us are DoD sensors. DoD sensors are not scientific sensors. They are not intelligence community sensors. Believe it or not, intelligence community sensors are very close to scientific sensors. They are calibrated, they are high precision, they are everything you'd ever want to know about a thing. DoD sensors have one purpose. They are to identify an object that is known and put a weapon on it. That is what they're for, right, predominantly. So understanding how do you calibrate those against these known objects? How do I fly an F-35 against a weather balloon at different speeds and different altitudes and different sun conditions and different lighting conditions and heating conditions? Those are all important measurements that need to be done, and we are in process of doing that right now. That table on the right is a very simplified version of our entire test matrix, which you would not be able to fit on 3 of these slides against all of our sensors across all of those phenomenologies. That will be useful in order to then train our operators, pilots, and sensors against the known objects. And then finally, our pattern of life analysis. This is essentially baselining what is normal. I have all these hotspot areas, but we only have hotspot areas because that's when the reports come in from the operators that are operating at that time. They don't operate all the time. So to have a 24/7 collection monitoring campaign in some of these areas for 3 months at a time is going to be necessary in order to measure out what is normal. Then I'll know what is not normal. Right, when we have additional things that come through those spaces. And that includes space and maritime. Next slide, please. Which brings me to some of my recommendations for the panel and their consideration and deliberation. Some of these we're going to be exploring with our new NASA embed, whom I'm happy to be welcoming on pretty soon, who's going to help us in our scientific plan. Crowdsourcing unclassified open source data. This is where some of the public can be helpful. Imagery from an iPhone is generally not helpful unless you are right up on whatever it is you're looking at. However, some of the ancillary data that your iPhone provides, from location to speed to other phenomenologies, and more than one of those can be very helpful. Right? Large-scale, ground-based scientific instrumentation. Evaluating how can I use some of these other instruments for detection. The FRB example was perfect, right? You have a bunch of large-scale instruments that were not designed for that, yet they picked them up because there was a microwave. Well, we have a surrogate target package of what we think these things are, at least from what we've got reported to us. That was in the front slide. Understanding how can I evaluate that against all of these other instruments, and do any of them have a chance of picking anything up that would be helpful in tipping and cueing us to get other sensors on target. I think leading that evaluation of the scientific ground-based sensors would be useful. Also, the same thing for the Earth Sciences satellites, as we mentioned before. Intentional vice coincidental collection. So looking at how can I provide a tip and cue to both the ground and space-based scientific and academic sensor community to put additional sensors on an object when it is reported. I'm currently doing that with AARO, the Joint Staff, the commands for when they get tip and cue, right? So a pilot says something, they see something, they report it in, and we're going to turn on a whole bunch of new collection to go after it. I should be able to hand that same tip and cue to the scientific and academic community. So looking at how that works would be helpful. Peer reviewing advanced capabilities, the parameterization and the publication of that have not yet been engineered. We understand a lot of fundamental physics. It is the scientific community's responsibility to explore and document those fundamentals in peer-reviewed scientific journals to match to data so that we can weed out all kinds of different hypotheses. Right? That's how science works. We need to make sure that we are doing that. I think leading that conversation would be very helpful from NASA's perspective. Archived scientific data. So we have a whole bunch of calibrated, large-scale scientific data from all these different instrumentations around the world. Taking a look at how can you apply maybe some AI, ML tools to search through that data for anomalous signatures that may correlate to things that we've got reporting on. That would be an interesting study. Distributions of sightings. I think this is a low-hanging fruit one, right? So if we take a look at all of the distributions of sightings that are outside of my national security areas that I've got classified reporting for, and they generate the similar distribution map as we've got, and we put those two pieces together, now I have a holistic picture. And then, of course, our foreign partnerships, building a robust scientific community of interest, review data, capabilities, conduct analysis, expanding upon our military and intelligence collaborations across the world into the scientific and academic world. And with that, those were my thoughts. We've talked about some of these in the past. It would be interesting to hear if there's any further questions or deliberations on any of those points, and I'm happy to take any questions that you all have.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Kirkpatrick. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank you and the AARO for your openness in providing this committee with insight and information about what you've learned so far, how we could work together. I think this is very much an area where it's going to be essential that NASA be a partner and be a good partner for AARO. And I think you're really want to thank you for your role with this committee in helping to start to build that partnership.
It's been my pleasure.
And let's, Reggie.
Hey, Sean, thanks for the briefing. Question. We talked a lot about data already. Let's talk about sensors for a second. So you mentioned that you work with labs, academia. Do you see a need to go beyond what you mentioned earlier? That is the type of sensors we have right now, which are based on national security threats and certain phenomenologies and frequency ranges, these kinds of things. Do you see a reason of going beyond that?
Yep,
and
absolutely.
So what are some of the challenges you see there, materials or what have you?
So can we go back to the front slide, just the first slide where the target characterization is? So we've purpose-built a couple of sensors to do search across that. Nope, down one. There you go. That's great. To go down some of those characteristics to see if we can find them correlated to pilot reporting. All right. Some of those are initially. This is going to be. I'm going to say this is a bootstrap method. Right. We're doing a broad spectrum search across very few indicators that we can point to that will enable us to get a little bit more data, refine that, narrow those sensors, and go from there. So we aren't just relying on the DoD and IC sensors that exist today, because frankly they don't point to where we want them to point. Right? I mean, I'll be frank with everyone. We can point the largest collection apparatus in the entire globe at any point we want. You just have to tell me where I want to point it. Second piece of that is a lot of what we have is around the continental United States. Most people, including the government, don't like it when I point our entire collection apparatus to your backyard, right? It's not allowed. We have some laws about that, and we've got to figure out how to do this only in the areas that I can get high confidence there's going to be something there, and high confidence I'm not going to break any laws doing it. Right? So there's a trade there. So some of these ground-based point detectors are going to be necessary for that, to point up, to point out, to search. Coupled with, we're evaluating a number of sensor opportunities across different organizations, academia, industry, whatnot, that already exist or are being built for similar purposes, or maybe other purposes that I might be able to recalibrate for this and see if those will have a chance of seeing that target. Right? So that's where the modeling and sim comes in. Can I take that target, put it into your sensor, and have a chance of seeing it? If I can, then I might want to use that. Right. Oh, wait.
Who's next?
Are you?
Nadia.
Go.
Hi. Thanks, Sean. I have the questions you probably don't want, which are about numbers, unless I missed them during your presentation. You had said that only a very small percentage of your cases display signatures that could be anomalous, and then followed that up with the few objects that do demonstrate potentially anomalous characteristics. What numbers are we talking about? How big is your database? How many years was it collected over, and were those observations made? And then by few, what do you mean?
Right. No, that's a great question. So this chart, as I mentioned, we've updated with our current data holdings. At the time of my open hearing, we were at 650 cases-ish. We are now over 800. We are putting together our annual report, which will be due August 1 to the Hill. And in it, and there will be an unclassified version, as there always has been, we will have those updated numbers at that time. We roughly get, I mean, you can do the math, you know, it depends, anywhere from 50 to 100-ish new reports a month. Now, the reason we had such a big jump recently is because I got FAA's data integrated in finally, and so we ended up with like 100 and some odd new cases. So there's reason why it's going to fluctuate. The numbers that I would say, so we're gonna try to do a little more fidelity on some of the analytics when we report out. But the numbers I would say that we see are possibly really anomalous are less than single-digit percentages of that total database. So maybe 2 to 5-ish%. Right.
Who's next?
Is this on? Hi.
All right.
I'll stand up because
I'm
I'm
gonna
on
get
the
you.
other end of the room. Thanks, Sean, for your presentation and for some of the video footage that we saw. While we're all good scientists on this panel, I think that I look at it with an untrained eye of looking at that video. And so I see 3 spots moving, and everything else in the background looks like it's stable. Can you talk a little bit more about either the sensor platform or what we're seeing that's stable in the background? Because they've been identified as airplanes, and there's clear description of from other data sources that came in to help clarify that. But when I look at this, what are all of the white spots in the background that we're seeing that are stable?
So those are that's a star background. Pretty sure that's a star background. Now, so you're looking at those planes were roughly 30 to 40-ish miles away, if I remember correctly. And when you see that smaller plane that comes in at the bottom, that one was much, much closer. It was like maybe 6 to 10 miles away, right? And so the jitter in the sensor is what you're looking at.
Right, okay, so the 3 spots, because they look like they're moving at about the same...
Right, they are.
Right, and if they were flying together, but they're not, is what I'm hearing. This is the sensor moving.
They're in a flight line.
Right.
So they're equally spaced in a flight line, and the sensor is jittering.
Thank you.
Yes.
Appreciate that.
Yes. Wait. Walter's been waiting.
Patiently waiting. Okay, if you go to your first slide, if you don't mind, not the title slide, but the one
trends
that had
slide,
the trends.
please.
Yeah, it's the previous slide.
There you go. Thank you.
So I want to make sure I understand the slide. It says typically reported characteristics, and there are a bunch of things here, like, for example, size, altitude, speed. If it's being observed from a single sensor, use the example of like the airplanes that were coming in, and if you don't know how far away they are, how do you assess the size?
Correct.
How do you assess the speed? This is what people would report, but it isn't necessarily,
What
for
is
example,
real.
the size of the object or the speed or any of the rest of it. Do I understand that correctly?
Partially.
Okay.
So this is not all single sensor observations. Some of these are very much multi-sensor observations.
Okay.
And this is parameterized to cover the range of things for any given parameter, the range of what's possible and what has been observed.
Okay, and then on the next slide, the one where you've got the, whatever
Orb.
it is, the meatball moving across the screen.
Right, that one.
So was there any look at sensor artifact, data processing artifact? I mean, the first thing that, whenever I see anything that's anomalous, I look at how was the data collected.
Yeah. So yes, these are so this is an EO sensor on an MQ-9, and we understand that very, very well. So that is a real object, absolutely. Anna Marie.
You mentioned that in partnership with academia, you also use AI ML techniques for existing data sets, possibly some of them open source. Can you explain a little bit more what kind of AI ML techniques you're using? Are these about anomaly detection? Are you using anything related to natural language processing? Are you using anything related to computer vision?
Right. So we're looking at a number of different capabilities that span, I think, a lot of what you've just said. So we've got, we haven't applied it yet. We are researching how we're going to apply it. So natural language processing for the reports from pilots, absolutely. All right. Target recognition, so I can train a model to look for that thing and go back through all of our holdings and go, give me how many of these you have, right? And then try to figure out what those are. Right? So I have not put anything out there yet, or have not looked at anything yet for active targeting in real time, because I don't know exactly what I would train it to go look for. I just know what we have. So I want to get more confidence on what we have before I go and do that, except for balloons, right? We're trying to get rid of balloons as quickly as possible.
So, Sean, I just wanted to begin by thanking you for your service to this nation, this committee. You don't exactly have the easiest job in Washington. So
no, I do not.
Appreciate it.
I'm glad you recognize that.
Yes, we certainly do. I also want to commend you noting the international partnerships. Spain just signed the Artemis Accords yesterday, increasing the membership to 25. I think that's a global partnership that you could leverage. Only 170 more countries to go, NASA, before everyone signed up. I just have two questions. One, relative to what Nadia was asking you about the number of anomalous phenomena. What makes it anomalous in your view? What is the phenomenology where you're pulling those cases out and saying this is truly unexplained? And then my second question would be relative to the stigma. How damaging is that in your view? And what in particular do you think NASA can do to help remedy the situation?
Those are great questions. I'm going to take the second one first because I know we're getting short on time. The stigma has improved significantly over the years since the Navy first took this on some years ago. It is not gone, and in fact, I would argue the stigma exists inside the leadership of all of our buildings, right, wherever that is. My team and I have also been subject to lots of harassment. Especially coming out of my last hearing, because people don't understand the scientific method and why we have to do the things we have to do, right? And because we can't just come out and say, you know, the greatest thing that could happen to me is I could come out and say, hey, I know where all these things are. Here you go, right? But I don't, right? And it's going to take us time to research all that. People want answers now. And so they're actually feeding the stigma by exhibiting that kind of behavior to all of us, right? That is a bad thing. Where can NASA help? I made that recommendation on NASA should lead the scientific discourse. We need to elevate this conversation. Right? We need to have this conversation in an open environment like this where we aren't going to get harassed. Because this is a hard problem. It is a hard target problem. We need to understand what is the things that are in all of our domains, space or air or undersea, and how do we make sense of that? Right. Your first question on what makes it anomalous to me, we actually developed some definitions on all of these things. We gave it both to the White House and to Congress. I think we've got some of that into law now, but essentially anomalous is anything that is not readily understandable by the operator or the sensor. Right? So it is doing something weird, whether that's maneuvering against the wind at Mach 2 with no apparent propulsion, or it's going into the water, which we have shown is not the case. That is actually a sensor anomaly that we've now figured out, and we're going to be publishing all of that. You know, those kinds of things make anomalous. Signature, we'll call it signature management, but it's things that are not readily understandable in the context of, hey, I've got a thing that's out in the light. It should reflect a certain amount of light. If it doesn't reflect that amount of light, something weird.
I think we have time for one last question.
Sean, you recommended foreign partnership with NASA. I'm curious, especially given your map, have you, as AARO, partnered with international agencies, and is there ways for reporting to your?
Mm-hmm. So that's a great question. I want to expound on that just a little bit. So I have just held our first Five Eyes forum on this subject last week, I think it was, or earlier this week. I don't know. Dan was there, and we have, we've entered into discussions with our partners on data sharing. How do they do reporting? What kind of analysis can they help us with? What kind of calibration can they help us with? What can we help them with? And we're establishing all of that right now. And they're going to end up, sending their information and data to us to feed into the process that we've laid out for how we're going to do all of this. Beyond that, I have not had either the time or the bandwidth to do, and that's why I would look to NASA to expand the scientific and academic relationships that they have across all of our allies and partners on how can we bring them into the fold. That's where I think there's a lot of benefit to NASA taking lead on that.
Great. Thank you. But one just clarifications for people who don't know, what are the 5 Eyes?
Oh, I'm sorry. For those of you that aren't familiar with the 5 Eyes, those are that's the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. So those are the 5 partners.
Terrific. So thank you very much.
Thank you.